Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Climate Conundrum Podcast. So, in the podcast series here, we try and explain basics of climate change and all that's happening around in the discussions leading up to the fight towards global warming, right? One of the main things that keeps coming up is decarbonization, or when people talk about climate change, they often focus on carbon dioxide emissions, and for good reason. CO2 is the primary driver of climate change. It remains in the atmosphere for hundreds of years. But then that's not the only thing. There's an underbelly that doesn't get discussed as much. And today I'm here to talk to you about that little bit, which is extremely important because there's a group of emissions that lead up to 40% of global warming today. I'm not going to go into any more details. I'm going to let the guest talk about this. She's an expert on this subject. So very welcome to Zerin Osho. She's the director for the India program at the Institute for Governance and Sustainable Development. And she's leading the development and implementation of IGSD subnational work on fast mitigation of short-lived climate pollutants, the topic for discussion today. So yeah, welcome, Zerin. I'm really excited to have you. And I'm going to let you introduce what you do and a little background about yourself, because I think it's best done by whoever is actually working in the field. So yeah.
Thank you so much, Sanika, and it's such a pleasure to be here and do this chat with you. So, to your viewers and listeners, a very, very warm welcome. Hi, my name is Zerin, and I am, like Sanika said, the director of the India program for an organization called the Institute for Governance and Sustainable Development. We are a research think tank on climate change and climate action based in Washington, D.C. And we have operations all over the world. We tend to work as a research organization focused on the research of non-carbon dioxide or non-CO2 emissions and pollutants. And that's where our specialization is. I would like to also probably say that I do not know if you're the only organization in the world that does research and focuses on non-CO2, but we will certainly be one of the handful, if there are others, which I'm not aware of, other organizations that solely focus on non-CO2 emissions. So I think we might just be the only organization in the world to do that. So that's something tiny about us. And the organization is comprises of lawyers and scientists. And I think it's a very interesting mix of people, and historically has been IGSD is 20 years old. And in these 20 years, the organization has grown to hire more and more scientists and hire more and more lawyers. And I think the reason for that grouping is that you need more scientists to explain to you, to conduct primary research, to understand what is the role of non-CO2. So all in all, it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you so much for having me today.
Thank you, Zerin. That was a nice introduction. I think it's very important what you just said. An organization that focuses on non-CO2 emissions, because that, as we're going to dive into this topic, we're going to see how important that becomes in the overall fight for climate change. But then the other part where I also personally have my foot in, right, about science communication. Scientists have to step up and work with organizations and lawyers and different kind of communicators to be able to explain the story. So yeah, in a microscopic.
That's exactly
This
what.
is what we're going to try and do here as well.
Yes,
Yeah.
and that is exactly what IGSD. It was founded by Professor Durwood Zelke 20 years ago, and I think that is Durwood's life mission, to be able to translate the science, primary science, which is complicated, very complex, caters to only a certain audience that is scientifically more involved and has that scientific bent of mind. But his idea has been, or the IGSD's mission has been, to be able to translate that through lawyers into treaty law, into policy making, into general discourse on climate. So I'm very glad that you said that, because not a lot of people understand what is the correlation between the scientists and lawyers working together. So that's it. You've got the secret sauce.
Let's get on with the curry then, with the sauce.
Yes,
Um,
absolutely.
I want to know, Zareen, what exactly is short-lived climate pollutants? I think that's a great place to start at, right? Because I just introduced this topic as why non-CO2 emissions are important, but then what does this even mean?
Yeah. So that's a great first question. And a lot of people in the world that I speak to do not know about the concept of SLCPs. So SLCP is the short form for short-lived climate pollutants. And the hint is in the name, short-lived. What carbon dioxide in your, as you explained in your introduction, carbon dioxide is a long-lived gas. CO2 exists in the atmosphere once it has been emitted for hundreds of years. And all of our science is based on carbon dioxide being the sort of benchmark. So everything is compared to, okay, one molecule of carbon dioxide is released, it has one global warming potential. And the world has focused on carbon dioxide. Short-lived climate pollutants are called short because they do not have that long extended lifetimes,
Mm.
and they will, be in the atmosphere depending on which emission or pollutant or gas you're talking about, from a few days in the atmosphere as their lifespan to say 20 years in the lifespan. So much shorter timelines compared to carbon dioxide. So that's what a short-lived climate pollutant is. And more often than not, um, it's an easy classification. Instead of using a complicated term as SLCP, what I have tended to do is to say it's non-CO2, because CO2 is long, everything else is short, so it's non-CO2. So very simply to be understood, it is anything that is not carbon dioxide, which has a longer timeline in the atmosphere. So that's what SLCPs are, very simply.
That makes sense. So then, which also makes me think that CO2 is the only other long emission that we have, or is that
No,
just a rudimentary way to sort of explain that, okay, well, anything
yes,
other than CO2 will be short-lived?
correct. So nitrous oxide is not necessarily a short-lived pollutant. It is a non-CO2, but it does not have shorter timelines as short as, say, black carbon does. So, or methane does. Methane lives in the atmosphere for 12 years.
Mm,
But when I say non-CO2, again, because I'm not calling it, I'm not trying to use scientific classification for
right,
non-CO2. It
yeah.
is something that I use in a layman term, so to say, is to designate the emphasis needed on things other than carbon dioxide, because the climate discourse globally has been on energy transitions, and rightly so. You need to transition out of fossil fuels 100%. But what you also need to do is to consider the impacts of other pollutants and gases that are not carbon dioxide. So there is a lot of emphasis that needs to be added on to, say, short-lived climate pollutants or a non-CO2 emissions of methane gas, which is CH4, and of pollutants that are black carbon. So in Delhi, for example, and all over India now, we have the most polluted cities of the world. That is a non-CO2 pollutant, which is black carbon. Black carbon is the soot that you get from unburnt carbon. So anything that turns black after burning or is giving you black smoke is
Mhm.
black carbon,
So all of
non
these
CO2.
categorized as the SLCPs, sorry, yeah, SLC,
SLCP.
yeah. And where do they come from apart from the sources you just mentioned? What
Yeah.
are some of the other sources?
So depending on what it is that we are talking about, the sources will be different. So let's talk about the most potent three non-CO2 emissions and pollutants. Um, I'll talk about HFCs. HFC
Mhm.
stands for hydrofluorocarbons. Very simply, to tell the layman what is an HFC, because it sounds very complicated, it is the refrigerant gas in anything that cools. Historically, we all were using CFCs, which is chlorofluorocarbons, which is also what led to the ozone hole. Then there was a treaty that came about called Montreal Protocol, and that has then ever since closed off all emissions of CFCs. So globally, it is the most successful treaty in the world, and that one treaty led to the stop of all CFC production and use. The world moved from CFC to something called as HCFC, hydrofluorocarbons.
Mhm.
And we very soon found out that HCFCs have low ozone depleting potential. So they damage the ozone, not as much as the CFCs, but it was an intermediate stage to sort of stop production and move away from CFCs to an intermediary. So the world could eventually figure out what to move to. So we moved to something called as HCFCs. Not only did it have a low ozone depleting substance. It was an low ozone depleting substance, but it had
Mhm.
a global warming potential, meaning that it was able to cause climate change, cause greenhouse warming. And then we started moving away, transitioning away, phasing away from HCFCs to something called as HFCs, hydrofluorocarbons, which are one of the most, it had zero ozone depleting potential, but
Mhm.
it had global warming potential 10,000, 12,000, 15,000 times more than one equivalent molecule of carbon dioxide.
Oh,
So they are super pollutants. So again, short lifetimes because they're short-lived climate pollutants, shorter lifetimes compared to one molecule of emission of carbon dioxide,
mhm.
but the global warming potential was through the roof, 10,000 times more warming potential, same amount of emissions, one HFC molecule, one carbon dioxide, HFC molecule 10,000 times more global warming potential, and carbon dioxide, one global warming potential. So HFCs are now being phased out. I am very, very happy and optimistic from the successes of Montreal Protocol that um, the world could come together. It's a testament to the fact that we could come together and work on one non-CO2 emission. HFC is the great case study for it. The
I
second,
usually love referring to this case study because, like you said, it gives hope.
it
Um,
gives you hope.
But there's also some misconceptions about that. A lot of times in discussions, people refer to how, oh yeah, a few years back there was this whole thing about ozone layer depleting, and now it doesn't exist, which means that the Earth basically healed itself. But
No,
I'd like everyone to remember again what you just said, right? It wasn't the Earth healed itself; it was because scientists came together and decided that we're going to
scientists
switch,
and policymakers,
and
countries came
industrialists.
together.
Yeah,
The global community came together to solve
exactly.
it, and we have solved it.
And we did it.
By
Exactly.
mid-century, the ozone would be back to its former self. We would have fully repaired the ozone layer. And in 2016, there was an amendment made to the Montreal Protocol called the Kigali Amendment. And the
Mhm.
Kigali Amendment, to me, in my lifetime, for our generation, is one of the most powerful things to have happened. In the sense that that was the finality of the decision that no more HFCs will be transitioned into by countries,
Okay.
because so the way Montreal Protocol works is that you have a grouping, so to say, two distinct groupings of countries: the developed countries and the developing countries. So
Mhm.
the developed countries had to transition away first and provide financing for developing countries, and then the developing countries had later sort of transition years. Only once the developed countries had transitioned over did the developing countries have to move. So Kigali Amendment in 2016 was signed at a time when the developing countries had just started transitioning to HFCs. And just as, so for example, in India, we use HFCs for a couple of sectors. That's about it. And
Mhm.
all other sectors, as a result of Kigali, have started moving away from HFCs. And soon we will be by 2028, which is the phasing down schedule, as they're called. By 2028, India would be moving away from HFCs entirely to other
Great
non
silver
ozone
lining.
depleting, non GWP or low GWP refrigerant gases. To give you an example, Godrej is one of the companies, Indian companies, that has moved away to no GWP, no ozone depleting substance potential um, alternative, which is a naturally occurring gas, propane, which is
Mhm.
a great thing. But we also need to understand that in the sense of, is that safe? Because propane is a highly flammable gas. So those things will have to be worked out, but it is a huge success, huge success.
Of course. Okay,
And this
that's
one
great.
treaty reduced 1 degree centigrade of warming,
Oh, wow. So there are these positive cases
avoided.
and that need to be talked more about. I'm so glad that we're having this discussion because sometimes everything starts looking really bleak. And in order to convince people to actually, I don't know, show some light, you need to see some light. So
Of course.
yeah, this is great news. So okay, summarizing what we know so far, right? SLCPs are short-lived climate pollutants. Their lifespan is about what, 5 years to 10 years or something even shorter,
Shorter, much shorter, shorter compared to CO2.
much shorter compared to
Yeah,
CO2.
like methane is going to be there for 12 years.
Right.
Black carbon can range between a few days to a few weeks. So depending on what the pollutant and gas is, lifetimes vary, but they're much shorter compared to carbon dioxide, which is why they're short-lived.
So the sources can vary from industrial applications, like say earlier we discussed refrigeration systems or other things, to even everyday like vehicular traffic, for example. There's all of that black soot
Yeah,
when you walk around on the
exactly.
streets lately. Is that what is the problem that is
Yes,
actually affecting all of us on our health, on like,
yes, that's you've got it. So
okay,
you
so
have figured out in a very simple manner what non-CO2 emissions are. So vehicular traffic, especially diesel, again gives you that black smoke. I'm sure all of us have been in Delhi or in cities in India where you're behind a car while you're driving somewhere and you see, acha, this one car has this really bad
mm,
black smoke coming out of its pipe. And that is unburnt carbon. And any unburnt carbon is black carbon, which is why it's black. In fact, to
I,
give you an example, kajal,
is made
it's
out of
made
that.
from surma. I don't know if coal and kajal are the same thing, but the olden day
Oh, they used
surma,
to burn this, yes.
exactly, that is black carbon. So
Oh,
we did
wow.
it for beauty.
Wow.
But the problem is when you have emissions of it, that's why वो black हो जाता था. The roof of the kamra or wherever there was a lamp,
Mhm.
oil lamp, that used to blacken out. That is the reason, because it's unburnt carbon. And Delhi may, the pollution that we have, which is PM 2.5, PM 10, there are composite, like that is basically black carbon. So if you stopped or improved vehicular efficiencies, if you changed your fuel type, if you move to electric vehicles, for example, you will be very easily solving for a lot of the pollution issues, because that is a component that you can change for and you can reduce.
So, what are some examples that you can share to sort of illustrate how it affects our lives? Sure, air pollution is one that we just discussed, but what other ways do SLCPs affect us?
Sure. Um, Before I get into the impacts, I also want to tell you a very small anecdote of human psyche.
Mm,
I am from Delhi and Chandigarh, and the reason I'm going to talk about my experiences of speaking to people, my neighbors, folks, you meet in parks while you're on an evening walk or whatever, has been that because you can see pollution, because we have a lot of emissions of PM10 and PM2. Like PM2.5 is not really visible to the naked eye. PM10 is, that's the smog that you see in Delhi.
mm.
When you can see it, you can question it. Then it becomes a point of worry. There are some short lived climate pollutants, like methane, which I'm going to talk to you about. You cannot see with the naked eye. It has no smell. You can't see it. And you will not know that there is, let's say, where you and I are sitting next to us, there is a methane emitting well. We will not be able to guess it.
Of course, out of sight, out of
What you can, exactly, out of sight, out of mind.
mm,
So what you will hear about other pollutants like methane in the news, which I will break down for you, is abhi recently there has now, I think, the most recent was the Gazipur landfill that caught fire in Delhi. It's a huge landfill. I mean, to me, it seems like it's the size of several football or cricket fields.
mhm.
And in terms of height, it would be a pretty tall, um, residential building, as one sees very commonly in Gurgaon or Noida, which are vertical heights. When that catches fire, what do you think catches fire?
The gases on,
It's the
and
gas. It's the
become a
methane gas.
microclimate in itself in such places, I'm guessing.
Exactly.
Mm.
You have, and now you have satellite data, and I highly recommend everybody who is interested in this field to look at satellite data for on top of India. And you see wherever there is landfill, huge landfills like Ghazipur, and Delhi has several of them, you will see huge plumes, these clouds of methane emissions. They will be denoted in purple color. When you have temperatures in Delhi, summer temperatures in Delhi touching 50 degrees centigrade, and you have huge methane emissions over these landfills, the friction, because methane is a very flammable gas, it catches fire. And then you have downstream impacts of it because again you are burning something, so black carbon will be produced. Health impacts so hai hi hai. You have communities that live around landfills, poorest of the poor. Health, loss of infrastructure, damage to infrastructure, health, ambulance, in like the whole thing sort of downstream.
Cascading effect then, because one
Exactly,
pollutant is leading to further few
exactly,
more bursts
exactly,
of pollutants. And I think I'm
exactly.
guessing in SLCPs as well, you have probably a ranking of which is the worst of the lot to probably the better ones we can deal with.
Yeah. So I spoke
Black
about
carbon.
HFCs. Exactly. I spoke about HFCs. HFCs to me were the worst because your global warming potential was in thousands, right? Now that we have dealt with HFCs, and obviously dealt in the sense that there is agreement and recognition that this needs to be taken care of, I feel that implementation needs to be strengthened. But if I were to go on to the next biggest problem that is not yet acknowledged, not yet spoken about, or not yet given the seriousness that it owes for saving the future generations and for our generations and the generations above us, because they will become older and frail. They will not be able to take on the pollution that they did when they were young.
Right.
For that particular problem to be solved, I think black carbon and methane are the two top tier priorities for me personally, because methane is 80 times, to be precise, 84 times more like powerful in terms of a greenhouse gas compared to carbon dioxide. And black carbon directly impacts your health. And then black carbon does other things which I will be happy to explain. But to me, I think methane is going to be very important. And the question that you asked me is what is their day-to-day impact? One is that landfill plume thing that I was telling you about, where it catches fire and there is direct, you can see it, aag lag gayi, loss of infrastructure. But to me, what is the most serious problem when I look at it, because I'm also reading a lot of scientific literature, is that non-carbon dioxide pollutants and gases directly contribute to heat stress. So the intensity of heat, our temperatures going 50 degrees. I remember looking at a video that somebody had sent to me on a summer day in Gujarat. I think it was Gandhinagar or Ahmedabad somewhere, where the road melted and the shoes got stuck to the tar on the road because people were trying to walk over a melted road. That level of heat, imagine what that does. Kids can't go and play in school fields. Everybody needs an air conditioner. It's not a luxury anymore. It is a means for survival. We are an agrarian economy. 50%, almost 50% of our economy is dependent on agriculture. The higher the heat, the less the productivity. So not only will we be unable to feed people domestically, India is a huge export country for food grain. We will not be able to meet exports. And that then causes another issue of problem in the global market, which is food shocks. So, and we saw that happen when Ukraine war started. And India said, we are going to ban exports of food because Ukraine was one of the largest.
Right. Yeah.
Sorry?
We banned rice exports
Rice
last
and
year,
wheat.
and it was
Exactly.
huge impact.
And you see how the global food market comes down on its knee because Ukraine was a huge supplier. India decided not to export. And if our productions fall, this is going to be a problem for the global market, and that is something that the world needs to recognize. But domestically for us, we will not have food to feed our own people. So heat stress is directly contributed by emissions of non-CO2. And that basically means your kids can't go play out in the school fields. The rickshawalas can't. We have, and a huge amount of our population in informal sectors of employment.
Absolutely.
The
People
the
work.
rediwalas, the rickshawalas, the
Yeah.
vendors on the streets, the street
Mhm.
vendors. What happens to them? You can't put an umbrella and say, I'm going to stand under 50 degrees of sun. So this is the direct impact of non-CO2 in a very human form. You will be testing the levels of human survivability at those levels of temperature. If your road is melting, we are in a serious problem.
Absolutely. So, Zerin, then obviously, I wonder what the policy environment in India looks like. We spoke about the Kigali amendment to this issue, but then what is India doing currently on this front?
So I think my personal opinion on this is it's a mixed bag of emotions, like you have right now. Um, while India is doing a lot in terms of um, making sure that emissions of methane and black carbon and non CO2 are tackled. For example, we have the National Clean Air Program, which is a central government policy, which is very, very critical for
Mhm.
air pollution and directly tackles like black carbon emissions and including some amount of methane emissions. That is subject to how good or bad we are in terms of implementation. Now, that depends on how um, efficient our pollution control boards are
Mhm.
at the state level and the center level. But a lot of states are making progress, but at the same time, a lot of states are not making progress. So that is purely an implementation question.
Okay.
At the same time, I was following the Lok Sabha discussions, and one of the questions that was asked in the Q&A rounds to the Ministry of Environment was there was a pledge that was started by the US and the EU called the Global Methane Pledge,
Mhm.
and India had declined to join the pledge. And the discussion question was about why is it that India had decided to decline
Mm.
the pledge. And the answer from the government was, oh, it's only there in the atmosphere for 12 years. And we only think that it warms 20 times more than carbon dioxide does.
Okay.
And we know that it's going to directly affect farmers. So, no. Now, those out of those three answers that the government has provided, apart from the first one, the two are factually incorrect.
Actually, they directly help lead the case towards stopping them.
Exactly.
Because if farmers are being affected, then do something about it. We are in a green economy. But no,
Exactly.
I'll let you finish.
Exactly. I mean, very simply put, that was my reaction. Like, how this is a no-brainer. What are you even talking about?
Mm.
But the way the government thinks about it takes a lot of work. You know, people like you and I who are well educated do not know what SLCPs are, right? Like today, you are learning about in a very simplified form of what is SLCP, what are these non CO2, why are they important? You are asking me this question, and you have worked in climate.
Right.
Now, that level of understanding has to be transferred over to the farmers as well.
Mhm.
And India is a country with small poor farmers. So
Mhm.
somebody needs to make the effort to have this information be taken down to the last mile consumer. I can vouch for a fact if you told the farmer that India is going to be experiencing upwards of 50 degrees centigrade, which is going to spoil your crop. Are you willing to be okay with us thinking about how to solve your crop yield? You tell me, Sanika, do you think a farmer in India will say no? The farmer is
Exactly.
dependent on it.
And actually, I have gone on the field and worked with farmers, spoken to them, interviewed them about climate impact as well as their role, what they think. And believe me, from Bihar to Maharashtra to Gujarat, the answers were pretty similar. And what I found as a trend was most of these farmers actually know that there's something wrong. They know where it sort of is coming from. Maybe they obviously won't be able to explain from a scientific lens, and neither can I, but they are more aware of the ground reality of the kind of changes happening, the kind of impact that it will lead to. So a lot of farmers are actually already thinking that, hey, you know what, temperatures are rising. I need to figure out how to keep my livestock away from heat. So they are thinking innovatively already, which I always feel like on a policy level, the government is lacking on.
That is, that's hitting bullseye. I think it takes a lot of time, lot of resources to be able to understand the reality of what we are going to be facing. And in some cases, I think again, human psyche, right? We maybe not, we at some level also do not want to accept reality that there is a possibility that we are headed towards the DJ, so to say. And so the discussion in the parliament was extremely disheartening for those reasons. Firstly, the like I said, the three reasons that they had given in the answer to that question of why India had declined joining the global methane pledge is because methane is in the atmosphere for 12 years. I don't know how that's even relevant, to be honest. Like, how does that matter if it's short-lived? More reason for you to act, I would say. The second reason that they said was that it has a global warming potential of 20. Now, where does that 20 come, and why is that 20 different from the 80 that I'm saying, right?
Mm-hmm.
Climate science and IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the way they do historically calculations and modeling. So we should also agree to the fact that IPCC is also a fairly political body. If you are a country that
Of
says,
course.
I don't like this, you can also challenge assumptions, right? Scientists work based on assumptions. So if you are a scientist who is not in agreement with my assumptions, may or may not be allowed to be printed as such, right?
Mm.
So there's a lot of that goes, there's a lot of things that go in the background of creating IPCC rules and how to do modeling and how to do assumptions, etc. Now, the reason why the government's answer included the number of 20 and why I'm saying it's 80 times more potent is because they, very simply put, what they do is they look at the global warming potential over something called as GWP 100, meaning what is the warming potential of one molecule of methane over 100-year scale. Now think about it. If methane only exists for 12 years, तो 100 साल में क्या ही कर लेगा वो?
So this is like a diluted data set,
Exactly.
which usually becomes
Exactly.
an issue in kind of time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. But if you reduce the framework appropriately to account for what is actually the warming potential of methane, because methane does not, it ceases to exist in 100 years. But if we reduce that timeline for understanding the potential of what methane is able to do to say 20 years, that number goes to 84. So the government's response was, oh, it's only 20 times more powerful than carbon dioxide and only exists for 12 years is actually not scientifically fully correct. It is correct to the extent that they are doing the calculation on a 100-year scale, but it is not correct if you look at it on a 20-year scale.
This
So
is
that was
so
my...
crucial. Thank you for explaining this, because I feel usually this becomes a sort of headlock situation when scientists are stating something, policymakers have taken that number or that figure and reverse implemented policies, uh, only to realize that, well, actually the data itself is pointing them to a wrong.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's absolutely right. And even between, you and I can have a different agreement. Like I know that there is no agreement of how to do GWP 120, and I'm not blaming the government. It is way above their, work, so to say, or outside their control, because scientists do not have an agreement on what to take. Is it GWP 100, GWP 20? Which is why we at IGSD believe that you should look at like for like. Don't try to convert everything to CO2 terms. The minute you do that, you are forcing yourself to follow the GWP 100 lifetime line. So you should always look at, the pollutant or the gas in its own entirety. Create smaller bubbles or smaller blocks, verticals, for each of the pollutants so that you figure out what is the right way of trying to analyze the warming potential instead of turning it all to a benchmark, which is CO2. Again, they were not crazy when they first did it. They did it because it was an easier, simplified way of saying, oh, if I reduce 20 tons of methane and you reduce 180 tons of carbon dioxide, it's apples and oranges, right?
Mm.
So, in order to bring everything to the common benchmark, the conversions were done. That was the
Common
intention of doing this.
denominator might be useful, but then again, in
Correct.
this case, for example, an SLCP has a lot more destructive potential in a very short time.
In a
So
shorter time.
the time scale needs to
Exactly.
be given there as well. Yeah,
Exactly.
this is extremely important for this discussion, as well as I wanted to bring this up on the podcast earlier, but I'm glad we're doing this now, as to how scientists measure and understand the impact of all these emissions. Um, but then now that we've talked about the impact and just generally how worrisome the situation is, I also want to know a little bit about the kind of solutions you guys present to get rid of these emissions.